once you start editing and putting the stories in order and they're in conversation with each other, it's a whole nother thing. It levitates to a whole nother level. You know what I mean? So that was really exciting to see.
All right, welcome everybody to another author chat here on SFF and today we're doing something special. We're going to be talking with the 3 editors of Africa Risen, which is a new anthology coming out from Tor.com in November on the 15th. And first up is Sheree Renée Thomas. She is an award-winning writer, poet, and spec fic author. She's also the editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, associate editor of the historic literary journal Obsidian, and has edited numerous anthologies, including the award-winning Dark Matter, which is fantastic anthology. So thanks for being here, Sheree.
Thank you. You forgot my favorite new things.
What is it?
New York Times bestseller, thanks to Janelle Monáe. Thank you. God bless her.
The memory, the memory librarian. Yeah,
yes, and the wonderful collaborators. Thank you so much. It was great. And also a Hugo Award finalist for the first time. Woo. So that was fun. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And next up we have and Black Panther too.
And Black Panther, my God, yes.
Yeah. And we've also got OGHENECHOWWE Ekpeki with us. He's a Nigerian spec fic writer and editor, and his fiction and nonfiction have appeared in publications like Omanana Magazine, Tor.com, Strange Horizons, and more. So welcome to the show. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah, happy to have you here. And last up is Zelda Knight. She's a USA Today bestselling author, British Fantasy Award-winning editor and bookseller. She's also the publisher and editor-in-chief of Aurelia Leo, an independent Nebula Award-nominated press in Louisville, Kentucky. So happy to have you with us, Zelda. How are you?
Hello, everybody.
Yeah,
thank you. In Salt Lake City now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gotta update my bio.
Representing Utah. All right. Before we get started, I just wanted to, congratulate the 3 of you. It's not out while we're recording this, but it will be out by the time this is released. But congratulations on the release of Africa Risen. How are y'all feeling about it? Yeah, there we go.
I'm feeling so excited. I got my author copies. I freaked out.
It's a beautiful cover too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're so lucky. It's just amazing, wonderful collection of writers. I cannot wait for everyone to get a chance to read these stories.
Yeah, me too. And just to start off, to share with viewers and listeners a little bit about yourselves, I wanted to know, what was your relationship with SFF been throughout your life? And then how did that kind of transition into publishing and specifically editing? So Sheree, we'll start with you.
Okay, I'll try to be succinct because I've been in this field for 3 decades. I've been reading science fiction and fantasy my whole life. My parents are big science fiction, fantasy, and horror, in particular horror fans. Mm-hmm. So we are part of that community. We were not a part of the fandom that appeared at conferences and conventions, right, and that, but we were a part of all of these amazing writers' bottom line. So I like to think that we helped fund perhaps 1 or 2 King family vacations over the years because we had a lot of Stephen King books. Fast forward, I'm in college. I had stopped reading science fiction because I didn't see a lot of representation in it. I was focused more on Black literature at the time, particularly Black women's fiction. I was reading, and I was in a slavery and literature class at Rhodes, and the professor included Octavia E. Butler's Kindred on the syllabus. Nice. And that really opened my eyes to how you can tell a story, what types of history and themes could be a part of it. And along with Charles Johnson's Middle Passage, it just, changed the trajectory of my life. I was working at an independent bookstore in Memphis at the time, and a friend of mine who's a wonderful writer herself, Jamie Hadley, gave me a copy of Black Enterprise magazine that had a feature cover story on Black women in publishing. And I went on to write a cold letter to them and found out that someone who was also on the board for the National Museum of Civil Rights, which I was a student rep at the time, knew the editor who had created that imprint, which is still in existence today, publishes Ta-Nehisi Coates and so many other great people. And he said that he would write a letter of introduction for me And she said if I got to New York, she would give me 5 minutes to talk.
That's all you got. Get up here and talk to
That's
me.
all
5
I
minutes.
needed. And so
Yeah.
I eventually moved to New York with my eldest, who was very small at that time. People thought we were going to die and be mugged. So I like to laugh in the face of haters today because I was like, we thrived in New York City. And that's how I ended up working in editing in an editorial department at Ballantine Books at Random House, and moving up and learning how to edit. And that's also the time period where the seeds were being planted for me to eventually work on what would become Dark Matter. So that's my introduction into publishing.
Nice. That's amazing. Yeah. It's like, fuck all the haters. I went to New York and
Some of those haters were sleeping on my floor too in Harlem. So we'll just say that. And they went on to launch wonderful lives eventually. So you be brave and bold.
Yeah.
It's easy to do when you're in your 20s though. So
True. I love that though. And Oghenechowwe, what about you, in terms of what was your relationship like with SFF? And then how did you eventually transition into fiction and editing and that kind of stuff?
My journey to SFF was very, very chancy. We happened to live near an old, dilapidated library when I was very young. So when my parents were going out, they would just drop us there, So we basically were babysat by the library. We were there. So we had no choice, no options but to read. They would pick us up in the evening when they were coming back. So, you spend the whole holiday like that. And I started by reading everything, but there was C.S. Lewis and there was some classic fantasy books there, which I connected with. And then, reading just paused for a while because books are very difficult to get on the continent, in Nigeria rather. Like new books, they are very expensive and they are only sold in, certain places. So they're not very affordable, especially science fiction fantasy books. So, but luckily, another lucky incident happened. My brothers got into King's College in Lagos, which was one of the major schools. So, they could buy secondhand books and bring back every holiday. So they usually came back with a stash of books, old secondhand books, reading was very, very askew, because it's like a huge bag, it's a huge pile. So you just dip your hand in the pile and you pick anything you can find out. So the books came in all the odd orders. You could be reading book 10 of the series as the first book. And the next time you get to read a book from the series is book 2. And the next book you might see is book 7. You read what you saw because, we couldn't get new books. So, and most of that kind of reading was very white because the books that get shipped down as secondhand books are usually the books that oversell, that oversaturate Western market. So they're usually by white male authors. They're usually fantasy and they're usually, traditional fantasy. So I tried writing for a while, but publishing is just as terrible as, in a place where it's difficult for you to get books to read. Publishing is, so, it was like playing the lottery. It was a very futile endeavor. So I skipped out on seriously writing until about 2016, 2017, with the internet, and online literary magazines, I started writing short fiction, sending my works out. I sold my first story in 2018. Then Zelda reached out. I won the No More Award in 2019. Then Zelda reached out in 2020 and asked if I wanted to edit the Dominion Anthology, and the rest is history.
Amazing. That's so cool. And Zelda, what about you? What was your sort of initiation with SFF and then getting into editing and all that?
Yeah, so for me, I guess I would say I came a lot from the geek culture side of things. I was really into the video game, the manga, the comics, the movies. That was really my introduction, and what I grew up on was sci-fi and fantasy. I actually did not read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy books. I was obsessed with Ray Bradbury when I was younger, and read like all of his stuff.
Yeah.
But I wasn't the typical, like, I was reading the Clark's World, Apex magazine. I grew up on, certain things. I was really more into the geek cultural side of stuff. When it came to, I would say, editing, I first kind of cut my teeth actually in the game world. I was making visual novels, tabletop RPGs, stuff like that. So a lot of geek cultural stuff. But then one day I was really, really like talking with some author friends and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I really wanted to try my hand at indie publishing. So that's kind of how I formed really a Leo, was putting stuff out. As Oghechowwe said, I had read a shorter version of his work, and I published it in Selene Quarterly, one of my magazines. It's defunct now. But I just thought it was really fantastic. And I was like, man, we should really get together. I would love more collaboration with continental African writers and people in the diaspora. I think that would be really cool. So we put out Dominion. And like you said, the rest is history. It's been a fun, exciting ride, and I'm so excited for Africa Risen. It has a lot of like familiar faces, like people I wouldn't say Black publishing is a small space, but you kind of run in the same circles. So it's like, I'll see names. I'm like, man, you're still putting out amazing work, or I read you there. I finally get to say I published you. Wow, like this is awesome, or edited you. So yeah, I'm really excited. But yeah, I would say, outside of Ray Bradbury, I would say I'm kind of the atypical editor. I didn't grow up on what you would call a lot of the classics of sci-fi fantasy. I would say I've watched pretty much every horror movie in English, Korean, and Japanese at this point, but I couldn't, name off all the, founding fathers of sci-fi that I really read. I was reading a lot of like alien romance and space opera and stuff like that.
No, but I think that's so representative of what's going on in science fiction and fantasy today, where it's like people are not only coming with diverse backgrounds, but they're coming with diverse trajectories of what they grew up on and the influences that they have. And it's so cool. It's like people who grew up on anime and stuff like that, more so than like classics like Tolkien or Bradbury, or the golden age of sci-fi or the golden age of fantasy or whatever. It's like, no, everyone's got diverse influences, and it's so cool to hear like, yeah, I read like alien romances and watched like Japanese and Korean horror movies and stuff like that. I love it. Yeah. And just to build on Zelda's excitement about Africa Risen, Sheree, I'll toss it back to you. I'm really curious, like, what were the origins of this anthology?
Oh my gosh. So you already know, I'd edited Dark Matter 1 and 2, and Oghechowwe and Zelda had edited Dominion, and they were going to work on a project. I had always wanted to do a 3rd volume of Dark Matter, and in fact, had put a call out. It was going to be called Africa Rising at the time. And it was the collection that I would have done first if I had, any actual relationships with African writers from the continent and knew them. And also, I would say if more African writers were actively in writing science fiction and claiming it as such, because that's a totally different thing. There was a time period where, not necessarily for writers who are writing today, but there was a time period where people were very, let's say, dismissive of genre work. They were very desperate to be validated in certain halls of literature with a capital L. And I guess they knew just on a pragmatic level that not at the time, speculative fiction wasn't being considered for Kane prizes and the Heinemann Prize when it was still a thing, and Booker Prize or the Arthur Miller Prize and those kinds of things. The British science fiction community wasn't, never even acknowledged Dark Matter. So I'm just going to give you, so we weren't a part of the conversations then. I think they've done a great job of being more diverse recently, but that was not the traditions in a lot of places. And in fact, when Dark Matter won its first World Fantasy Awards, I was really surprised, genuinely surprised, because I didn't even know at the time that Octavia Butler or Samuel R. Delany hadn't won that honor. And so I ended up being the first Black writer to win the World Fantasy Award. period, no matter the genre. So that all of that was very new. And I was working in a field in which people only spoke of Octavia Butler and Samuel R. Delany as writers of science fiction. And if they were more into it, they knew that Stephen Barnes wrote, or they knew that Charles L. Saunders had been writing since the 70s, or they could name maybe Jewel Gomez if they were keeping up with smaller presses outside of the Big Five or the feminist press community. But it was really much a different environment than today. This was before social media, and it was not as welcoming, I'll just say that. For me, and some of the writers, though, all of that began to change. So the origins of this comes out of a place of the past, sort of, but also recognizing that there's a lot more hope and possibility today. And we changed the title from Africa Rising, because I remember OG and I having this conversation about backlash for for that concept that as if Africa needed to be developed when it came to literature. And we wanted to be more hopeful and recognize all of the good pioneering work that was being done already. And of course, Dominion being a part of that. For me, Dominion was a big part of that work. So those are some of the reasons. Yeah.
I appreciate you bringing up the title, because that transition from Africa Rising, and Oghenechowwe, I want to get your opinion on this. Africa Risen, you each sort of like write about this in the introduction. Africa isn't rising, it's already here, it's already risen. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay, yeah, sure. But I'd like to jump in on some things that Sheree said.
Go for it.
Because her story intersects with mine, on some very strong levels, which I guess it's the relationship between Black writers on the continent and, in the US and the diaspora. What she said is very true. Speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, not being considered real literature. It wasn't just, it was everywhere, especially on the continent. People were grappling with all these issues like, I guess they were grappling with them everywhere, but there was this much. It was very strong how people needed literature to connect with our issues, with slavery, with colonialism, with all these issues. So science fiction, fantasy, nobody wanted to hear or see that. It's John Snobbery, and it's still a thing today. It's not gone, So yeah, I could connect a lot, when she said that. It also contributed to there being less visible SFF writers on the continent, because nobody wants to. But the larger problem, because she said there were not a lot of writers, associating as SFF writers. It's an issue of access. Like I told you, getting SFF was messed up, was difficult, next to impossible. Writing SFF, publishing was flat out impossible on some level until the internet. And even when the internet came, Nigeria is poverty capital of the world. It was unaffordable to a lot of people. So until publishing is the problem, So I just wanted to chip in. I think that there are people who could always connect with SFF, who read SFF, even if it's the way I read it, very here and there. But I think it was a problem of access. I just wanted to chip that in. Access, there's a blockage. So it's not that they didn't want to, it's that they couldn't. So mailing your work physically all the way to the US, to a magazine like F and SF, where you have 0.0 something % chances of getting it. It's not possible, So.
And then on top of that, it's like the mailing costs probably are more than what you would even receive for having that.
Not even
story
more.
published.
It's impossible. I don't think we had infrastructure that could do that.
Yeah.
Our post offices, I don't think they could do that at all. So. And if they could, the process.
But I received digital submissions as well. And one of the South African universities shared my call for submissions, but I mean, it's very limited for, one country, one one country for the entire continent. Yeah. So I definitely received digital, submissions, but I just
I know, I was talking
didn't have the
about
relation.
way back before the internet wasn't. I get that the internet was accessible a long time ago, but it wasn't accessible on the continent in Nigeria until very recent. In fact, lots of people cannot afford to be online in Nigeria now in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very small part of our people like me who are online. We're the elite. Lots of people cannot afford, Anyway, that's so. I just wanted to chip that in.
I
it's
appreciate
more of logistics and access. So, yes. Down to your question. What was the question again?
About the transition from Africa Rising to Africa Risen.
Oh,
how
yes. Yes. There's this it's actually a complex thing because for me it's more like listening or looking at the environment and accommodating the ideals that other people will have and being able to see the other side of the story. As honestly as far as I'm concerned, there's still a lot more work to be done. You could say Africa has risen in terms of literature and SFF literature, but I still think that there's still a lot more that needs to happen. I don't think there's enough. I don't think we've maxed out the progress that we can. I mean, like we're talking about access. I was the first Black writer resident on the continent to win the Nomo Award for African speculative fiction. That's an award that is exclusively for Africans. And I was the first Black African on the continent to win it in 2019. So the problem of access is not entirely done yet. But at the same time, we can acknowledge that a lot of work has been done. Mm-hmm. And a lot of work was being done in the background even before it was clear. So, for me, I guess Africa Risen is about acknowledging and seeing that work, so.
Yeah. And on that note of access, I think it kind of plays into what the three of you acknowledged in the anthology in terms of the authors that you are representing here. And I wanted to touch on the selection process for the stories. Zelda, I'll get your take on this first. How did you go about, selecting these stories, but also what OGHENECHOWWE was talking about in terms of the access and what these incredible authors, you have this diversity of authors from the African diaspora to people from the continent, but also you have new and upcoming authors as well as people who are a little bit more established. So how did you find that balance there? And how did you go about, pitching people on the anthology, receiving stories and selecting them, especially with this kind of notion of access, like who has the ability to actually send stories to the three of you,
Yeah, I would say for me, the selection process / submission process for Africa Risen was really, really unique. The first time I had co-edited was with Ekpeki, right? So it was difficult because like you have to balance two very different ideas of what makes a good story, right? Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of writers, there's technical things, right? Like send it in the format and the way we tell you to submit a story. But once you get past those dope basics, I mean, my personal opinion, editing is a very subjective field, right? What I think is excellent, both of them were like, oh no, that's not good. That's right. And so I'm like, this story was the best thing I read like from the slush pile. So I think to your point, I think what worked in our favor is that we have a lot of diversity on our own team, right? Sheree is really connected in the traditional publishing field, right? She can, be like, hey, I know this person are, well established. Oghechowwe is really connected, obviously, with what's going on, the pulse on the African continent, right? So you can really have your feelers out, talk to people, and do that. I wouldn't say, I'm top of the field in this sense, but I think I would say more connected with the indie field, because indie publishing is pretty much where I am, right? A lot of the upcoming authors, right? I know them from the smaller mags where they're publishing, where they published with me. And I literally was like, hey, you need to submit a story. This is going to be a big deal. It doesn't matter if it's going to be these big names in this table of contents, get your story in, get it considered, right? And so I think that really helped us get the word out about it, and also get some really, heavy hitters in the field on the table of contents, plus these new and upcoming authors.
Yeah, I love that. As I was preparing for this interview, I kept referring to you three as like the powerhouse trifecta of editors. So it's like, but you laid it out beautifully. It's like each of you has your hands in different areas of publishing, whether it's on the continent, whether it's traditional, whether it's indie in America, the diaspora, that kind of thing. So I think it's really interesting that you realize this throughout the process, and then you were able to work together based on each of your subjective opinions of a given story or what have you. Sheree, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, OG and Zelda had worked together on Dominion, and I had come to Dominion as a reader and a fan. I really enjoyed it. I love the beautiful cover art. It really pulled me in immediately. And I wanted to signal boost and celebrate this, because it felt like, for me, it felt like a dark matter moment. It felt like a change. The last time I had that kind of excitement was when I met Dr. Ronaldo Anderson, and when John Jennings invited me to come to Planet Deep South, that they hosted, which is a Black Speculative Arts Movement conference they had at Jackson State University in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, where they're both alums. And to me, having been a part of Afrofuturism, like shortly after Mark Derry, the cultural critic, coined the term, definitely a part of it before that, but we didn't have the term then, right? Being a part of the original Afrofuturism.net listserv, and actually just now starting to think of myself, I was one of the people that shaped the genre in terms of literature. It felt like a very important time that was happening. And so Zelda's right. We definitely have each of us have different tastes. Some of it overlapped. And so we were able to identify some stories that we all were like, yeah, that's a good, that one stands up and above, some of the others. Sometimes authors sent us more than one story. And so we had to kind of, when we had to pick, which story that really stood out for us. And there were a few stories where we're like, I'm gonna fight you on this. I keep thinking, all my life I had to fight, it's like, and then I kept thinking, my experiences editing over the years, I know what it's like, what it feels like to have a book and the thing that you most wanted in there is not in there. You know what I mean? Because you got vetoed or something happened, or it fell through. You weren't able to get them, on past the, to the contract or what have you. And then you just think, oh, what could have been, right? The road not taken. And I didn't want any of us to feel that way about any stories in the collection. And so we had, like, I guess, I don't know if we call it a wild card or whatever, but there's some things we were just like, it's yours, you got it. And I don't think none of us are going to regret it, because once you start editing and putting the stories in order and they're in conversation with each other, it's a whole nother thing. It levitates to a whole nother level. You know what I mean? So that was really exciting to see.
Yeah, because I mean, there are, if I'm remembering correctly, I think like 32 stories in the collection, which is quite a lot. Which is quite a lot, but I like how you say, they're in conversation with each other. And I think that is really the key to a good anthology or short story collection, where every story stands out on its own as a unique entity, but they are all in conversation with each other. And for me, reading Africa Risen, there was a big through line for me, which is the way that African traditions and folklore transcend the boundaries of time and geography and genres even. How I want to know how each of you feel about what I kind of refer to as like historical and cultural resonance, whether it's a writer from the diaspora or whether it's a writer from the continent. There is a power and pride in one's heritage and history and memory and myth, and how those things kind of infuse into them as an individual author writing their stories. Sheree or OGHENECHOWWE Zelda, do you want to get in on this idea?
I'm going to get it before I get emotional, if you don't mind, because I'm going to be emotional, so I'm trying to keep it in. I'm at a crossroads right now, and just your questions are really sparking up a lot for me. But I'll just say, I'm thinking of legacy, and I'm thinking of the future in terms of changing the way I approach my editing work. Editing initially started off as like a dream, so I could be around people who love language, around people who love literature, and I can get free books. And at the time when they were doing the shrimp and wine cocktail parties at book publishing houses, that was very exciting, you know. And then we got very budget conscious, and so those went away. But still always can get the free books. But it was also a means to an end, because I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a published author myself. And so I thought, if I'm going to have a day job, let it be in the world of literature. Let me find out the mystery behind the Wizard of Oz veil and see what's behind there, and how do you make a book? What's the sausage making part of it? Now working with the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, I'm more aware than ever that I'm also, as an editor, in the world of dream making. I'm making some of their oldest, like, childhood rooted dreams come true by publishing their stories. And I'm thinking about the impact that dark matter had on publishing when it first came out in 2000, and the writers who were so kind and generous to trust me with their work when I didn't have a reputation in the field at all, and didn't have a huge publishing footprint for them to look at and see. But these amazing writers like Octavia E. Butler, Samuel R. Delaney, Walter Mosley, Ishmael Reed, Amira Baraka, Wanda Coleman, and some of them are no longer with us, right? Tanana Reed, Stephen Barnes, Jewel Gomez, and Nalo Hopkinson, and all of these amazing new Pam Knowles, Anthony Joseph, like all of these writers trusted me. And now I see where they are now. I remember having conversations with some of them about the dreams that they had for themselves then. And to see what they've been able to achieve over the years is important. So when I look at a book like Africa Risen.
It's okay.
And I hear OG talk about the very real pragmatic struggle it is for artists in the continent of Africa and abroad to even have access to some of these spaces, to have their stories be read by people around the world. I have to be reminded and humbled again to think that the things that I take for granted myself are not things that everyone can take for granted, and that these stories are vital, and that these stories are needed, and that for publishers to take the time and the space to create room for collections like Dark Matter, for collections like Africa Risen, for Dominion, for Zelda to take on. I know what it means to be an indie publisher because I did it very briefly myself. And I was like, not for me.
Yeah.
God bless you. Go forth and prosper. But you have to have on 10 hats, right? And the skills of the most amazing accountant ever, right? And distribution, right? And so I think about Africa Risen and the possibilities for these writers. Some of them are already like superstars, and some of them are emerging, and all of them I think are going to be fantastic in the future. And I just think of what 2 more decades, what we're going to be saying about these writers in 2 more decades, 1 more decade, 5 years from now. And we'll be able to say, wow, readers will write me like they do for Dark Matter. I read this story, in this class, or I was in graduate school and we were studying this, or I use this with my family. We talk about this story, or, I'm very hopeful. That's all I can say. Very hopeful.
Me too. OGHENECHOWWE, do you want to get in here?
Yeah. I mean, I would actually like to go back to the previous question, talking about the editing process. I wanted to acknowledge something. You know, writing and editing, it's a very cultural thing. It's identity plays a very huge role in how we process stories, how we tell stories, and how we receive them. You know, and editing a book like this that has I mean, we're all Black authors, but we come from different divides. You know, Sheree has been in professional publishing. Zelda has been in indie publishing, you know, and they're both in the US. And I've been on the continent and, you know, not in any kind of publishing, but I've interacted with writers unofficially and their stories. It puts us at very different places, you know, how we receive, how we process stories. So that kind of editing requires a lot of trust and respect. I'll be honest with you, there are some stories in Africa Rising. I don't know what the hell they're doing. I don't know why they're there. You know, but I trust my co-editors. You know, I don't know what those stories are doing. And I'm sure there are some stories there that they like, you know, but you know, that's also the beauty and the strength of the anthology. I was telling Sheree at some point that this anthology has everything. You know, it has action stories, it has issue stories, it has all kinds of narrative styles. It's complete. And that's because of the different places that we come from. We're able to infuse all this. So when you talk about Blackness, we have different facets, different styles of it. And that's because we're able to accommodate, you know, each other's, you know, perspective and positions, you know, and you know, we're coming from a place where there's room for, there's the possibility of friction, you know, because we're coming from different places. Sheree, for example, is the oldest person here and the most experienced, you know, so it's easy for her to impose that experience and say, you know, Zelda herself has been editing for about half a decade before we did Dominion together. So she's also far more experienced than I am. But despite that, like Sheree said, there are some stories that we were able to, that one editor can put their foot down and say, this is what I want. I was particularly able to do that. And it was, they were able to accommodate, you know, so it was a very, very, it was a very wonderful experience. Let me put it like that. And it's going to show in the final product, you know. When people get to read the book, they are going to see the effect of this kind of editing in the book. So
yeah.
Some of those stories have already been singled out as standout.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I feel justified. I know you feel justified.
You did
it. I was like, see, follow your instincts.
But that's the cool thing. It's like combined instincts. It's like each of you have your own, you know, I thought it was really cool in the introduction how you acknowledged storytelling began in Africa. Humanity began in Africa, and therefore storytelling began in Africa, because we've been storytelling, you know, orally for millions of years, whether it's just expressed through body language or whether it eventually became language.
Yes.
But I love that it's like storytelling is instinctual in a lot of ways, and that depends on your culture, your background, your family, so many different factors. But the fact that the three of you were able to come together and give your editing its own instinctual nature, and then combine that where it's like you're really satisfied that you picked this story, Sheree's really satisfied, Zelda's really satisfied, all of you compromised, but you also collaborated. And I think that's really telling when actually reading the collection. And Sheree, I think you gotta jump out in a minute or two. Do you want to just let people know where they can find you on social media before we jump out?
I'm on social media. I'm not the best on social media, you know, but I'm on Twitter at Black Pop Mojo, just because Twitter didn't give me enough letters to put my full name. And so for many years, I was known by my hoodoo name of Black Pot Mojo, but Wanga Nagres is a whole nother conversation, so I didn't choose that. So there's that, Black Pot Mojo. And also, you can find me under my name, Sheree Renée Thomas, on Facebook. And ShereeRenée.Thomas is actually where I actually hang out more. And then the author page, I'm kind of over there randomly. So be careful which one you choose. And on Facebook, on Instagram, I'm under my name, Sheree Renée Thomas. And of course, you can find and subscribe and read the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and very exciting things are happening there. And I'm in the world. And look for the, of course, my first novel that I ever finished that I'm happy with in the world. And it's Black Panther, Panther's Rage.
Yeah.
Just came out on October the 11th. So it was Tuesday. So that's why you see me like my child self is ecstatic.
Amazing. So cool. Awesome. Well, Sheree, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to continue with Zelda and OGHENECHOWWE, but really happy that you could be here with us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I met Multiverse in Atlanta, so I'm enjoying myself.
Awesome.
It's a great con.
Bye-bye. Take care. And OGHENECHOWWE, I want to touch on this notion of storytelling again, because I think, like I was saying, storytelling is a very personal thing for a lot of people, whether it comes from their family, their culture, what have you. Or for you personally, like, what does storytelling mean for you and for where you come from?
Okay. I shared an essay with you, Too Dystopian for Whom, the Continental Nigerian Writer's Perspective. Because it explains my connection with storytelling. For me, it's earlier I talked about how speculative fiction was shunned. There's John Snobbery. It's not considered serious because people want to grapple with their existing realities, and they feel that literary fiction, realism helps them do that better. But I don't agree with that, because I do exactly the same thing with my literature, with my speculative fiction. It helps me connect, process, and grapple with the existing realities of the day as a disabled person in Nigeria, as a Nigerian. There's all these things that come with being a Nigerian. Frankly, it's a lot of struggle. I think that's the one thing that is most synonymous with being Nigerian: struggle, not to sugarcoat it. So for me, literature gives me an outlet to process these things, to communicate with the world, to show, be seen, and be heard. And it's the same thing with editing and publishing. For me, it gives me a chance to show that side of the story, to also help others tell their story, and give them a platform to be seen and heard.
Yeah, I really respect that. And Zelda, what about you, as someone who's in America as part of the African diaspora? Where does storytelling come into your life, and how does it? How do you feel about this tradition of storytelling, and how it's transcended from one continent to another and becomes such an integral part of your life?
Yeah, so I would say for me, in a more, I would say, academic sense, my background, and I'm going to do a tangent and come back to your question. I'm actually a historian. That's my background. So I'm all the way into a PhD right now. And usually you would call it Africana Studies, but this particular one is actually called Pan-African Studies, right? So, I'm deep in the weeds of this, right? And it's always amazing to me, coming from, a family that was obviously enslaved, right? From Baltimore, Maryland. I have my great-grandma Millie's and Nathaniel's marriage certificate. They were freed, then they were slaves, right? So they was freed after the war. And a lot of Black Americans actually don't even have that. They can't even go back a great, or a great, because so many disconnections in family. So I'm really lucky to have that, can tell exactly where, at least I landed, if not where my lineage is. So in a purely academic or familial sense, I find it so amazing to see how many traditions survive. You were talking about like how in this anthology, even though it's so diverse, there's so many people from the continent, all the countries there, all across the world, is a lot of these historical trends and tensions that you can see throughout all these narratives. And so for me, what I really love about Black storytelling, yes, a lot of times it can, I see reviews all the time. It was with Dominion. I've seen a couple already for Africa Risen. The anthology gets really dark, right? And then, it gets really dark. And I always laugh at that, right? Because I'm like, not really. I mean, this is pretty much the light side of what, if you read actual historical documents, what really happened to people, right? This is the fantastical. If you actually read the history, it would get really, really dark, I would say. And so what I really love about it is that, a lot of it does come from historical trauma, but it also comes from, us preserving traditions, people from Haiti having similar stories and similar mythological understandings of the world from people from the continent. So overall, I find specifically Black storytelling is always a wealth of knowledge and always makes me feel really connected, because I'll read stories from people whose lives are utterly different from me, even though we're both Black, or we might both be Black females. But at the same time, I can find these kernels of like, I can really, really relate to this experience. So for me, I feel storytelling is relational. You tell stories because you want people to hear them. You want people to enjoy maybe something that happened in your day or just fit. And so coming to stories like these, it just makes you feel more connected to Black people in general.
Yeah, I agree completely. And, Zelda, as an indie publisher, someone who's in the indie space, and then OGHENECHOWWE is someone who's come into it a little bit more recently. You shout out numerous magazines and anthologies and indie publishers and stuff like that in the introduction. I wanted to get your take if there are any more, whether it's a publisher or a magazine or an anthology, what have you, that you'd like to give a shout out to here that maybe you didn't mention in the introduction. OGHENECHOWWE, do you want to start first?
Okay. I would like to draw attention to the Bridging Worlds anthology. It's an original non-fiction anthology. It's titled Bridging Worlds: Global Conversations on Creating Pan-African Speculative Literature in a Pandemic. It's basically pandemic non-fiction, a non-fiction anthology about how writers coped with creating during the pandemic.
Cool.
It has Zelda Knight and Sheree Renée Thomas in it. It has, some of the most active editors, publishers, writers, and creatives in Africa and the diaspora. Chinedu Mohegbo of Uncanny Magazine. It has, like I said, Zelda and Sheree. It has, Shingai, Njeri Kagunda, Lisa Yvette Ndlovu of Voodoo Nuts. It has Maziwonwu of Omenana Magazine and a lot of amazing writers. So while you're getting Africa Risen for fiction, you can get that for non-fiction.
Nice. I like that. And Zelda, what about you?
Yeah, we shouted out everyone under the sun in that introduction. So it was a
lot of shout outs, yeah.
It was thorough. But I would say one that I didn't shout out that I've been coming to their works much more recently would be Neon Hemlock Press. It's a small press that mainly puts out queer, like science fiction and fantasy. I read a novella by Ebony Dunbar, Stone and Steel, and I really, really enjoyed it. And they also put out Glitter plus Ashes, Queer Tales of the World That Wouldn't Die. They've actually been winning some pretty big awards right now, but they publish a lot of queer Black authors, and I haven't had a chance to read them before, and they're writing some awesome stuff. So if you want more Black speculative fiction and you want to support indie presses, I would say Neon Hemlock is definitely someone to be looking out for, / they're already well on their way to putting out some classics, I would say.
Awesome. And Zelda, I'll get your take on this as well, and then we'll go back to OGHENECHOWWE. what role do these, I would say like from collective projects like a publisher or a magazine or an anthology all the way down to individual authors, what role do they play in the overall mission and community building of African speculative fiction?
Okay. I mean, they all play. They're all a part of the whole. They're all pieces of the mosaic. Everybody has. They bring their story, they bring their contribution, and together we make up the whole of African, speculative industry. Because I believe that no one story, no one person's part is adequate to build up the community, or I believe that it's going to require a combination of all of us, all the different parts of us. Everybody's story is vital. No one story can make up a culture, can build up, especially one that has been torn down as much as Black and African communities and societies have been, which is why I'm very passionate about editing, publishing, and the things beyond just my writing, because I can't do it alone. Sheree can't do it alone. Zelda can't do, no, it's going to take all of us. So that's what all those things mean to me. Everybody's piece is, one more thing towards completing, the big picture.
Yeah, I love that. Zelda, what about you?
Yeah, I think the main thing, you said it best, is the community building aspect, because of structural barriers everywhere. Even if you're in the US, publishing is still very much located in New York, which is one of the most expensive cities to live in the world. And the rate, the pay rates for people in publishing are not matching, being in one of the most expensive cities in the world. So there's a lot of structural barriers, even if you're in the US, let alone if you're anywhere outside the United States of America, right? So I think, the roles that we all play is that community building, and also, putting people down when you see opportunities. I can't tell you, how many times I've seen a writer, either a publisher or I've seen them in the space. They're like, hey, you really need to submit to this. This is really, good. This is something you should do. Or, hey, this is happening. Hey, do you know anybody, et cetera, et cetera. So I really do think the community building aspect helps you persevere through all the structural issues that you'll see. At the end of the day, some people have a zero-sum idea of the world, everybody's competition, right? But I found a lot of times you thrive more when you see, hey, we're going up against something much bigger, aka the white dominated publishing space. If we work together, we can make a lot of real magic happen. So I think that's the main role, from just the connection, fellow writer to writer, all the way up to publisher, which you could do for Black speculative / African speculative fiction.
100% agree with that. Yeah, I love that. And just to close out, I would like each of you to recommend an African speculative fiction book that you really love and you want to share with everybody. I'll toss one out first. We were talking about him before we started recording, but Alex Jennings, really great guy. The Ballad of Perilous Graves is a fantastic book. Really cool, like surreal urban fantasy set in New Orleans with music as magic. And I love that. It's like the coolest, most refreshing like magic system that I've seen in a long time. Even though it's not super well defined, I love the fact that music becomes magic in that book. So shout out to Alex, really awesome guy. OGHENECHOWWE, do you have a recommendation?
Nothing at the top of my head right now.
Let's shout out to Dark Matter by Sheree's Anthology, which is came out in like the early 2000s, but if you're going to read Africa Risen, I recommend checking that one out as sort of like a, read Dark Matter, then read Dominion, then read about Africa Risen. Those three come together really nicely. Zelda, do you have any recommendations?
I've been really on a novella kick right now because I'm working full time and don't have time to really dive into deep worlds. So I would really, really recommend Flowers for the Sea by Zen E. Rockland. She has a lot of, or they have a lot of other shorter stuff out too. But this novella, I'm telling you, it's something, and I can't tell you more without spoiling it. But you really need to read it if you haven't already.
Yeah, and it's a novella. I'm totally on the same page as you. It's like I love reading a novella as a sort of cleansing practice between longer fiction and stuff like that. It works really well. But OGHENECHOWWE, Zelda, shout out to Sheree. She had to jump out for a panel. But thank you all so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Can you please let people know where they can find you on social media? So OGHENECHOWWE, we'll start with you.
You can find me on Twitter at PenPrince, PEN, PenPrince _. And you can also check out my website, OGHENECHOWWE, then Ekpeki, EKPEKI.com.
Awesome. And I'll link to all this in the descriptions as well so people can find that really easy. Zelda, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me pretty much anywhere on social media at Author Z Knight, Knight as the one with the sword, starting with a K, pretty much everywhere. But also, I have all my links on my website, authorZKnight.com, and that has all my pen names, all the stuff I'm getting into.
Awesome. And Africa Risen, by the time this is released, Africa Risen will be out, so you can pick that up on Amazon, brick and mortar, wherever you can, through Tor.com. So thank you all so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.